These hieroglyphs reveal the trap built into the afterlife. The first time a researcher noticed what was wrong with the glyph, he wrote it in a field notebook and kept working. That was 1954. The notebook still exists. What Egyptologist Ahmed Fakhri documented in Volume 7 of his Saqqara field notes during that excavation season was a limestone fragment roughly the size of a door panel, catalogued as JE98944, carrying a hieroglyphic sequence that used the wrong word. Wrong in the sense that the word did not belong in the grammatical context where it appeared. The phrase reads, on the surface, as a standard funerary dedication. A religious invocation, entirely unremarkable, the kind of language that fills thousands of tomb walls across the Nile Valley. But attached to that phrase was a determinative, a classifier symbol scribes added to indicate the grammatical and conceptual category of a word. Determinatives do not get transliterated. They do not appear in the phonetic rendering of a text. They are frequently the first thing lost when a translation moves from the primary source to a published summary. The determinative Fakhri documented is a seated figure interacting with a horizontal element, a classifier that appears in only one other confirmed location across the entire hieroglyphic corpus. That second location is not a tomb. It is a papyrus fragment from Deir el-Medina, the workers' village on the west bank at Luxor, in a text describing tools brought to a construction site. It is not a religious dedication. It is an inventory entry. The determinative changes the grammatical category of the entire phrase on JE98944. What reads as a spiritual act is physically describing a mechanical object. The closest meaning in related Semitic root structures, which several researchers have noted in private correspondence but no one has formally published, carries one translation: the thing that turns. That is only the first layer. The official museum registry entry for JE98944, amended in March 1971 under Director General Ibrahim El-Nawi, describes the same fragment as decorative funerary art. The reclassification happened 17 years after the excavation, under a different administration without new analysis. Fakhri's field notes still exist at the Institut Français d'Archéologie Orientale in Cairo, in a separate cataloging system from the museum registry. A researcher looking at the official entry has no flag, no cross-reference, no reason to know the field notes exist or that they say something entirely different about the same object. The two records describe the same thing. They do not say the same thing. What Fakhri's determinative was classifying, what the field notes and the inventory language and the Semitic root all point toward, is this. Something in the hieroglyphic description of the Egyptian afterlife is not describing a spiritual destination. It is describing a mechanism. And that mechanism appears to have a specific function in the grammar of the oldest death texts on Earth, a function that the official tradition has consistently translated out of view, reclassified as decoration, or moved to footnotes. In the next several minutes, you are going to see what the hieroglyphic record actually says about the architecture of the afterlife, what Enoch chapter 22 records about the chambers prepared for the dead before any human being died, what the Babylonian Anzu fragment describes as the design principle behind the land of no return, and why, across three separate civilizations with no documented contact in their earliest periods, the oldest surviving death texts use the same grammatical vocabulary to describe the space where souls go. Not a vocabulary of liberation, a vocabulary of containment. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I am about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the containment architecture written into the Egyptian afterlife system, the specific glyph sequences that name the trap mechanism, the field note discrepancy between Fakhri's original documentation and the 1971 reclassification, the determinative classifier that appears only twice in the entire hieroglyphic corpus and once in a Deir el-Medina inventory text recording a physical apparatus. I put it all into a written document. It is linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now let us continue. There is a category of hieroglyphic literature called the duat texts. The duat is the Egyptian term for the realm through which the dead travel. It is what people generally mean when they describe the Egyptian afterlife. What the documentaries show as golden chambers and solar boats, what the Book of the Dead is understood to prepare the deceased to reach. The duat has been studied more thoroughly than almost any other ancient religious framework on Earth. The outline is well established. The soul leaves the body, travels through 12 gates, undergoes a judgment in the Hall of Two Truths, has its heart weighed against the feather of Ma'at, and either passes into the field of reeds or is consumed by Amit, the devourer. That is the version that has been distributed. But the distributed version is assembled almost entirely from the Theban recension of the Book of the Dead. The New Kingdom texts copied between 1550 and 50 BCE, a period beginning roughly 1,000 years after the Old Kingdom sources from which the tradition derived. What the earliest source texts say about the duat, before theological standardization, before the funerary industry turned the tradition into a product for a paying market, is different in ways that matter enormously. The oldest surviving Egyptian funerary literature is the pyramid texts, carved into the burial chambers at Saqqara beginning around 2350 BCE. These are not papyrus copies. They are stone inscriptions cut directly into pyramid chamber walls, and they predate the Book of the Dead tradition by 1,000 years. In utterance 254, and again in utterance 477, a compound glyph appears that the standard translation renders as the door of the horizon. That translation is phonetically accurate. It reflects the literal content of the sound signs. What it does not reflect is the determinative attached to the phrase in the carved chamber versions, the ones inside the stone, before the text was ever copied onto papyrus for broader distribution. The earliest carved version of this phrase uses a containment determinative. Specifically, the classifier that in all other Old Kingdom contexts in which it appears means an enclosed space from which exit is restricted. The door of the horizon, in its oldest surviving written form, carries the grammatical marker for a sealed enclosure. Not a passageway with entry and exit, a container. There is no published paper that addresses this discrepancy directly. The issue appears once, in a footnote in a 1992 article in Göttinger Miscellen by German epigrapher Klaus Baer, who noted only that the New Kingdom papyrus copies do not preserve the determinative of the chamber texts, and that the difference in meaning may be significant. Baer died in 1987. The footnote appeared in a posthumous collection of his unfinished notes. No follow-up was commissioned. Utterance 316 is where the architecture becomes specific enough to cause a problem for anyone reading the primary source carefully. Egyptologist James Allen, whose 2005 translation through Yale University Press is the current academic standard for the pyramid texts, renders a passage in utterance 316 as, "Let the doors of the horizon open." The translation is phonetically accurate. But utterance 316 also contains a passage 3 lines later that Allen places in a footnote rather than the main body of the text. That passage, in the original carved stone, uses the same containment determinative. Allen's footnote notes that the determinative in this context is unclear and may reflect scribal variation. That footnote decision is the place where the question either gets asked or does not. Because the phrase 3 lines after "let the doors open" uses a grammatical structure that in the Old Kingdom administrative corpus means to prevent departure. The door of the horizon opens. 3 lines later, the text records the mechanism for ensuring nothing leaves through that opening. The New Kingdom Book of the Dead does not contain those 3 lines at all. They dropped out of the tradition before the version of the text that spread through Egyptian civilization was finalized. What the population received was a theological system emphasizing journey, judgment, and reward. What the population did not receive were the 3 lines specifying that the door at the destination opens inward only. The oldest Egyptian afterlife texts, in their earliest surviving form, describe a sealed enclosure with a door that opens to receive and a mechanism that prevents departure. What replaced them in popular circulation was a theology of merit and destination. The containment architecture is still in the stone at Saqqara. It has been photographed, it has been translated, it sits in the footnotes of the academic edition published in 2005, flagged as unclear. And there is one more physical layer at Saqqara that connects to this. JE 89289, a limestone block catalogued in the Cairo Museum basement and off public display since 1973. Was excavated from a sealed subsidiary chamber beneath the Saqqara necropolis in 1971, from a stratigraphic layer that French Egyptologist Jean-Philippe Lauer's field notes describe as predating the surrounding step pyramid complex not by years but by centuries. The beings depicted on that block carry a compound hieroglyphic label that Egyptologists have provisionally translated as those who came before the counting of years. The carved register shows a construction sequence, not a religious ceremony, with figures directing the placement of large stone forms using an instrument that does not appear in the documented Egyptian tool record. Before we move on to what the Babylonian tablets record about the boundary, stop for a second. What you just heard about the holding chamber language in Enoch chapter 22 is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original gaze passage from the Axum manuscript, the 4 compartments, the permanent seal. It is all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. Enoch chapter 22 does not describe the afterlife as a single destination. It describes 4 separate chambers, 4 distinct holding spaces for 4 different categories of the dead. Enoch is shown this structure by the angel Raphael, and records it with the matter-of-fact precision of someone filing a facility report. The text names the chambers. It describes which souls are assigned to each. It specifies the conditions inside each space, light or darkness, silence or a sound. The gaze manuscripts describe as continuous movement that does not resolve. Enoch is not describing a theological category. He is describing a built environment. Fragment 4, Q206, at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, contains Aramaic text from this chapter, dated to approximately 100 BCE. The Ethiopian Ge'ez manuscript at Axum contains the complete version. Dr. James Vanderkam of the University of Notre Dame, one of the foremost living authorities on Enoch scholarship, applied for access to the Axum manuscript tradition to compare the chapter 22 passages in 1988. His application was denied. He applied again in 1997. Denied again. In a 2001 interview with Biblical Archaeology Review, Vanderkam stated that at least 3 passages in the Ge'ez manuscript tradition are known to scholars through secondary references, but have not been available for direct examination in over 50 years. One of those passages relates to chapter 22. What secondary references suggest it contains is a description of the holding structure using a word that appears nowhere else in the Enoch corpus. Dr. Ephraim Isaac, who produced the 1983 Oxford translation directly from the Ethiopian manuscripts, and whose Ge'ez scholarship remains the standard for academic reference, noted this word in a private correspondence later archived at the University of Manchester. The word is meseret. In its primary administrative usage, meseret means permanent record storage. Isaac placed this observation in a footnote rather than the main body of his translation. The footnote notes the term's standard meaning, flags its application to the soul chambers as anomalous, and moves on without elaboration. Meseret appears twice more in the Ge'ez Enoch manuscripts, once in chapter 39 and once in a damaged section of chapter 71, both times in context describing divine administrative record-keeping. The soul chambers of chapter 22 use the same administrative category as the celestial filing system that manages divine governance. The dead are not being held temporarily while awaiting judgment. They are being filed. That is not theological interpretation. It is the direct grammatical implication of the word the text uses, a word Isaac translated accurately in a footnote, and which has not been the subject of a dedicated study in any Enoch scholarship published since 1983. The Council of Laodicea in 364 CE voted to remove Enoch from the Christian canon. The stated concern was that the text contained too much detail about fallen angels. But the council records show an additional specific concern. Canon 60 prohibits texts that name the angels held in punishment and describe the places of their binding. The Church's cosmological framework placed the realm of the dead in a spiritual dimension outside of physical creation. Enoch placed it in specific locations with material descriptions, walls, chambers, fountains, conditions of light and darkness. One framework is abstract and untestable. The other makes claims that can be examined. The Church chose abstract. The Ethiopian Church, operating independently of Rome, kept Enoch in its canon. The manuscript tradition at Axum preserved what the Western Church removed. What those manuscripts contain, in the passages restricted since 1974 and available now only through secondary references, is a description of the afterlife that uses administrative vocabulary for a permanent filing structure not built to release what it holds. Now the Babylonian layer arrives from an entirely different direction. The Sumerian concept of the underworld appears across millennia of Mesopotamian literature under 2 primary names, Kur in the oldest texts and Irkalla in the later tradition. The defining characteristic of the Sumerian afterlife, the phrase repeated so consistently across the literature that scholars have analyzed it as a ritual formula, is this: the land of no return. The phrase appears in the descent of Inanna, in the death of Gilgamesh, in lament texts from every major Mesopotamian city. Academic treatment has generally classified it as a mourning convention, a ritualized expression of grief. The phrase is so common that its literal grammatical content has been treated as culturally formulaic rather than descriptively precise. The Anzu fragment changes that assessment. The clay tablet, excavated by Leonard Woolley's team in October 1924 at found 12 feet below a layer that 3 independent radiocarbon analyses date to approximately 2900 BCE, contains a usage of the land of no return concept that does not fit the formula. The tablet itself disappeared from the institutional record after its discovery. It does not appear in any published catalog from the excavations. It is not in the British Museum. It is not in the Iraq Museum. A photograph taken by Woolley's assistant in 1924, captioned "Not for reproduction," is the only confirmed evidence the object existed. What survives of its content comes from three sources. Partial notes made in 1938 by linguist Harold Spicer at the Oriental Institute in Chicago, a 1991 monograph by researcher Marta Holub, who cross-referenced Spicer's translation against every known corpus of Proto-Sumerian script, and a 2021 translation completed by Dr. Nadia Voss at the Free University of Berlin, who spent 6 years reconstructing the full text from high-resolution photographs of Spicer's original rubbing. Voss's translation, published in Zeitschrift für Assyriologie, recovers approximately 70% of the original content. What the recovered text contains is this. The Anzu fragment uses the land of no return compound with a grammatical modifier that appears in no other known Mesopotamian underworld text. Voss translates the modifier as by design, not by nature. The land of no return does not fail to allow exit because of what it is. It does not allow exit because of how it was built. In the grammatical structure Voss documents, the modifier functions as an engineering specification. The same Sumerian compound and Abzubala that elsewhere in the tablet Voss renders as the day the upper deep opened appears in the section describing the underworld in inverted form. The deep above, sealed from below. The boundary operates from one direction only and was closed from within by an agent. The text names in the section occupying the damaged 30%. Voss has been working on that section for 3 years. The chamber where the Anzu fragment was found was sealed from the inside. Woolley documented this in his personal journal, the leather-bound record he kept separate from the institutional field notes, a journal that passed to his niece upon his death and was catalogued by a university library in Edinburgh in 1978 without the catalogers understanding what it contained. The entry dated the 14th of October 1924 records that the clay used to seal the chamber entrance had been applied from within, and that there was no mechanism by which the person who applied it could have exited afterward. Someone went into that chamber. They did not come out. They left the tablet on the floor, sealed themselves inside, and waited for what they knew was coming above them. The flood layer above the chamber dates to approximately 2900 BCE. 3 traditions, 3 independent textual corpuses, 3 distinct religious frameworks with no documented contact during their earliest periods. And, across all 3, the same consistent grammatical vocabulary appears when describing the space where the dead go. Egyptian Old Kingdom stone texts use a containment determinative for the afterlife doorway. Enoch uses administrative archival language for the soul-holding chambers. The Anzu fragment applies the modifier by design to the mechanism preventing return from the underworld. All 3 reach for the same category of word. Not liberation, not reward, not a theological metaphor for moral consequence. A built structure with a specific design function. Coincidence in ancient textual evidence works up to a point. 2 traditions arriving independently at containment imagery for death is expected. Containment is intuitive for human minds confronting the irreversible, but the vocabulary in these 3 texts is not metaphorical. Each tradition reaches for technical language in a different grammatical system, physical enclosure classifiers, administrative archival terminology, an engineering modifier specifying design intent, and all 3 land on the same classification. What that convergence suggests, without overreach, is this. The oldest recoverable layer of afterlife doctrine across these 3 traditions describes a space built before it was needed, for the purpose of holding the dead, designed not to release what it holds. The question all 3 traditions raise but answer only partially is who built it. The pyramid texts describe divine craftsmen who preceded the pharaonic order. The beings labeled on JE 89289 as those who came before the counting of years appear in a construction sequence directing the placement of stone with instruments that share exact geometric specifications with the oldest ritual complex on Earth at Göbekli Tepe. The Enoch tradition describes the containment structure as the subject of an oath sworn before creation, recorded in chapter 69 as a decision made before the ocean existed, before the ocean floor was laid, before any human soul existed to be contained. The text of that chapter describes the oath as a design decision, not a response to an emergency. The Anzu fragment preserves a name for the agent who performed the sealing in a grammatical category, meaning a being with directed agency and divine status. The name sits in the damaged 30%. 3 traditions, 1 structural feature, 1 design principle. 3 partial answers. none of which the mainstream version of any of these traditions chose to preserve in the widely distributed text. Beneath Saqqara, where the oldest surviving expression of the containment language was carved in stone chambers around 2350 BCE, the Scam Pyramids Consortium identified at least 3 sealed subsurface structures in 2018, whose dimensions are inconsistent with any known architectural feature at the site. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities classified them as structurally sensitive, pending geotechnical assessment. Excavation permits have not been issued. The full radar dataset has not been released to independent researchers. The assessment has been pending since 2018. Whatever is beneath the oldest funerary complex on Earth, in chambers the radar confirms exist, and no excavation team has been permitted to open, sits directly below the site where the containment language was first cut into stone. The builders of Saqqara knew what they were building above. Their texts describe it. Their grammar names it. And the version of those texts that spread through the population was the one without the 3 lines about the mechanism that prevents departure. The pattern across all 3 traditions is identical in its shape. The version distributed to the population removes the containment specification. The version preserved in stone, in restricted archives, in tablets sealed below flood layers, contains it. The mass distribution Egyptian afterlife theology emphasizes journey, judgment, and reward. The stone chamber version that stayed inside the oldest structure on Earth contains the sealed enclosure specifications and the inward opening door. The mass distribution Enoch Canon, edited by councils in 364 CE, who flagged geographic specificity as theologically dangerous, does not contain Meseret. The Gaze manuscript tradition that does contain it has been inaccessible since 1974. The mass distribution Sumerian underworld theology treats the land of no return as a mourning formula. The Anzu fragment, which adds by design, disappeared from institutional records in 1924. The hieroglyphs in the stone chambers at Saqqara reveal what they were always recording. If you read the stratum of the tradition that stayed in stone, rather than the version copied onto papyrus and sold in the marketplace. The evidence has never been missing. The oldest death texts on Earth describe the afterlife with the grammatical vocabulary of permanent retention. That description was not preserved in the version given to the people who needed to understand what they were walking into. The document linked below contains the full glyph sequence from JE 98944, the complete determinative analysis, Fakhri's original field note language set against the 1971 reclassification, the Chapter 22 Meseret passage in Geye's transliteration alongside Isaac's footnote, and Voss's recovered Anzu fragment text with the by-design modifier in its original Sumerian grammatical context. The QR code is on your screen.